Philippians chapter 1. Let me ask you while you're turning there, how many of you actually enjoy flying? How many of you enjoy like not just traveling, not vacation, but the flying part, okay? Some hands went down, but okay, quite a few hands still up, okay? All right. Now, how many of you flying you're like me, you're okay flying, but every time the plane hits some turbulence, your prayer life significantly improves? Okay, all right. Thank you. I'm not the only one. There's just something about that moment when the plane suddenly drops 10 feet and your stomach stays up there. You know what I'm talking about? It's, have you ever noticed, no matter how much myself or the other passengers, no matter how much you're freaking out, you're praying, you're confessing sin, while we're scared, the flight attendants are completely calm. You notice that? I'm over here gripping the armrests, and they're casually walking down the aisle. They're smiling, handing out pretzels. We're on the same plane. We're feeling the exact same turbulence, but we're experiencing it completely differently. So whenever the turbulence gets really bad, I start getting nervous. I've learned this. I learn where to look. I watch the flight attendants. If they're still walking around, they're still smiling, they're handing out cookies and coffee, man, then you know what? I figured we're probably okay. And you know what happens? The turbulence hasn't changed, but the way I'm experiencing it has. Because sometimes what changes your experience isn't a change in your circumstances, it's a change in your perspective. And I think that's exactly what we see from Paul in the second half of Philippians chapter 1. Because if you were with us last week, if you remember his circumstances, Paul should not be okay. We started a new sermon series last week through walking through the book of Philippians. And if you remember, Philippians is simply a letter Paul wrote from where? From prison. Think about that for a second. In a moment, the life you knew is gone. You had friends, you had family, you had plans, you had some sort of idea of what the rest of the year was, what you were going to do, maybe the next 5 years of your life would look like. You had a plan in your head, and suddenly you're not in control anymore. And every morning you wake up in the same place with the same unanswered question over your head. When or is this going to end? You fix this microphone. I apologize. Woof. That didn't help it. You guys hear me? All right, sorry about that. That's not a bad week. That's your whole life being turned upside down. And here's what's striking about this passage we're going to get into in just a second. When we read this, I want you to notice this. Paul doesn't sound like a man whose life is falling apart. Paul's life is not okay. Yet somehow, Paul is. So the question I want us to ask this morning is, how? How can we be okay? Here's the question. How can we be okay when life isn't. Paul goes on to tell us how. Number one is this. Don't let what happens determine your happiness. Don't let what happens determine your happiness. Look in the text, look at verse 12. Paul says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters. He said, lean in here with me. He says, I want you to know that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. I love how crazy this statement is. Paul was just literally, here's what happened. He says, I want you to know what has happened to me. How do I get this? There we go. Is it, I need yellow. There we go. You guys see that? He said, I want you to know what is happening. What happened to Paul? Paul was attacked by a mob and arrested for Jesus. He was, for preaching Jesus. He was shipwrecked on the way to Rome, to the prison. He was nearly assassinated. And then he was imprisoned for 2 years. As he writes this letter, he's still in prison in Rome, awaiting trial, not knowing what was going to happen to him. And Paul looks at all of that and says in verse 12, guys, all of this, all of what has happened to me has actually been good for the gospel. That's a pretty insane perspective. He says, I know it looks bad, but you're not going to believe what God is doing with it. Look in verse 13. Here's what happened. He said, listen, he says, as a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord. And listen to this, and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. So the Romans, did you catch that? The Romans throw Paul in prison so he'll stop spreading the gospel to new people in a new place. What happens? The gospel spreads to new people in a new place. In prison, Paul found a brand new mission field. The guards were a captive audience, Paul found. That's what he said. In verse 13, he said, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard. And he said, into everyone else, that I am in chains for Christ. So yeah, Paul's life got smaller, but the gospel got a whole lot bigger. Paul doesn't pretend, he doesn't deny what happened to him was terrible. He doesn't pretend prison was enjoyable. He just looks around and realizes, hey, I may be chained up, but the gospel sure isn't. And notice in verse 14, he said it this way. He says, and because of my chains, not in spite of my chains, because of my chains, other Christians there in Rome have become more confident and dare all the more to share the gospel without fear. See, all Paul wanted to do, remember, was advance the gospel. He probably just never imagined the gospel would advance like this. Some of us probably need to hear that today. I think because we tend to have a very specific picture in our minds of what it looks like for God to be working in our lives. You know what I'm talking about? Like we think if God is working in my life, then this specific door that I'm praying for is going to open. Well, if you're working in my life, then this plan I'm hoping for, I'm going to lay out my fleece. Story of Gideon. You know, God, I'm going to lay out my fleece. God, if this is you, then this thing's going to happen. God, if you're in my life, if this is you, then this problem I've had is going to go away. But sometimes what looks like an interruption to our plans is actually part of God's plan. See, Paul couldn't control what happened to him, but he refused to let what happened to him determine his happiness. In fact, I just got one of these for the first time about a week ago. It's called a gimbal. You guys know what these are? It's a camera stabilizer. And so the idea is if I'm recording a video while holding my phone, I left my phone down there. Cody, could you grab my phone for me? It should be in that second. I try to remember to keep my pocket. It should be in that second pew right there. Thanks, man. Thank you so much. Round of applause for Cody. We love Cody. So this is the gimbal. It stabilizes your phone. I'll show you in just a second. So if I'm holding my phone like this, the idea is you're recording a video, and as I'm like walking around like this, and if my hand moves to the right, what happens to the phone? Goes to the right. If my hand goes to the left, phone goes right with it. If I drop my phone, I catch it. Whatever happens to my hand happens to the phone. With this cool thing called a gimbal, let me see. I just bought it, so hopefully it cooperates with me, because this morning it has a mind of its own. I've been watching too many AI movies. You guys notice AI is like the villain of every movie lately? We'll see. We'll see if it takes over. Okay. Now notice, let me make it come out here a little bit, just for the fun effect. Now, here I am. Same move. Watch this. I'm going to move my hand to the right. What happens to the phone? Stays in the same spot. Doesn't rotate, nothing. Move my hand to the left. Phone's in the same spot. No matter what movement I do, phone's right here. Phone's stable. So, what's going on here? The movement doesn't stop. My hand is moving just as before. The circumstances around the camera are still just as shaky. But somehow something is keeping it steady. You guys following me here? The circumstances didn't stabilize. The camera did. And this is what Paul's telling us. His life is shaking. But Paul isn't. Not because his circumstances had finally settled down, they didn't. But because his life was centered on something deeper than his circumstances. So here's the question. What is truly at the center of your life? I'm not asking what are your circumstances. That's usually what we want to give. That's usually the first thing we want to tell people. That's usually what we tell God. If your life's anything like mine, you either just came out of a storm, you're in one right now, or what's the saying? Well, there's probably one somewhere on the horizon. Our circumstances will never, listen, our circumstances will never be how we want them to be in this life. Don't shoot the messenger. There will always be something we wish were different. Something we're waiting on, something we're worried about, something wild that we didn't see coming that just comes out of the blue, no matter how much planning we do, no matter how much money we earn. And if you're waiting for everything around you to finally settle down before you can finally have joy, you're going to be waiting your whole life. That's why happiness needs something deeper than our circumstances. It needs a center that doesn't depend on your circumstances. That's something that doesn't move every time your life does. And there's only one center like that. So only one center that won't change when everything else does. Only one center that lasts when everything else fades. And that's Jesus. Which leads to our next point. How can we be okay when life isn't? And it's this. Man, don't live. Number 2, don't live for what you can't lose. Don't live for what you can't lose, for what you can lose. Now remember, before we read this next verse, remember the context. Remember Paul just told us that his imprisonment had actually made other Christians in Rome bolder about sharing the gospel. You remember that? Now look at what happens next. This is crazy. Here's what happens. Look at verse 15. Paul says this. He says, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing, notice this, that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. I love this so much because Christians today, we often talk about how we want everything to be we want to be a New Testament church. You ever heard that language? You ever use that language? As if, and I get it, but we talk about the New Testament church as if like Christians in the first century did everything right, and then we messed it all up later. What do we see here? Apparently, church drama is just as old as the church. I mean, it took Christians all of about 5 minutes to figure out how to turn preaching, how to turn ministry into a competition with each other. What does it say? It says, look at verse 15 again. It says, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. Verse 17 uses another phrase. They do it out of selfish ambition. What does that mean? In other words, they were preaching the right message, but for the wrong motive. And think about the context. They were risking their lives daily to tell people about Jesus. But they were also worried about who got the credit for it. And with Paul stuck in prison, man, apparently some of them had the thought, hey, this is our chance. Now, I doubt they ever maybe had those cognitive thoughts. They probably never thought those exact words. maybe didn't even recognize their own false motives. It's usually how it goes. They were doing ministry. They were probably just telling others about Jesus. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being about making Jesus known and started becoming about making themselves known. And what does Paul get? They started thinking, the thoughts came in, why does Paul get all the attention anyway? Can you imagine the conversations they would have why does Paul think he's so special? Why does he think he's the only one that could write a book of the Bible? Come on. Who is this Paul guy? Is he the only one that could start a church? Is he the only one that God can use? It's kind of funny to think that way. It sounds almost ridiculous to imagine those conversations happening, but it also sounds strangely familiar, doesn't it? Because comparison and competition always have a way of creeping into even the things we do for God. And notice they weren't only trying to build themselves up, but usually what happens when jealousy and comparison gets involved, they were even trying to get under Paul's skin. Verse 17 says that they were preaching out of selfish ambition. It says not sincerely. Look what it says. It says supposing that they can stir up trouble. Everybody say trouble. Trouble. For me, Paul said, while I'm in chains. He's like, I'm already in prison, and they're trying to cause me more trouble. We don't know exactly what that looked like. It doesn't tell us. We don't know what they were doing or saying to Paul, but apparently they thought their success, while Paul was still stuck in prison, would somehow get to him. That he would get jealous like they were jealous of him. Now listen, if Paul were living for the same thing they were living for, man, that would have really worked. If Paul needed to be the most successful preacher in Rome, man, that would have eaten him alive. If Paul needed recognition, then their success would have felt like his failure. But they made one big mistake. They were trying to beat Paul at a game that Paul wasn't playing. Look at verse 18. I love this response. Paul said this. Look what he says. But what does it, say the next word? What does it matter? What does it matter? He says the important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. He says, and because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. They're thinking, guess what, Paul? We took your influence. Paul said, wait, are you preaching Jesus? They said, well, yeah. He said, so are people hearing the gospel? They're looking at each other like, why is he smiling? Yeah. He said, what does it matter? Because Paul's goal was never to make himself famous. It was to make Jesus famous. And you can't make someone jealous of your success when your goal was never your own success. Paul wasn't living to be the biggest name in Rome, so what was, you say, Paul living for? You say, how can someone just ignore all of that and not even care? How can someone be in prison? How can someone have people trying to still jab him? How could someone take all those hits and just not care? What was Paul living for anyways? Look at verse 19. He said, for I know that through your prayers, he's talking to the Philippian church, and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. He seemed pretty confident. He said, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body. And notice this. He has this confidence. He has this eagerness. He's sitting in prison and he's like, I know I made the right choice. I know I'm not going to regret this. No matter what happens, whether by life or by what? Or by death. He's like, I think I'm getting out. In fact, I'm counting on it. But he says, guess what? Either way, he said, I have no regrets. Why? Paul says, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. That's Paul's secret. How do you get to a place where others can take your influence, can take your recognition, can lock you in prison, even threaten your life? And you still say, what does it matter? What does it matter? Because Paul had built his life around something nobody could take from him. For me to live is Christ, he said. To die is gain. What does that mean? Paul looks at two possible outcomes in front of him in his situation. He could get out of prison and live, or he could be executed and die. And he concludes, no matter what happens to me, catch this, I win. I win. If I live, I get to live for Jesus. To live is Christ. He says, man, how awesome is that? And if I die, then I get to be with Jesus. That's even better. It's gain. Come on. How do you beat a guy like that? It's like trying to play a game with a little kid who keeps changing the rules. You ever tried that? My Jefferson, my 6-year-old, he'll say, he's done this. He'll say, Dad, let's see who can hold our breath the longest. I said, okay. We start the game. And as soon as he gives up before I do, I'll say, okay, I win. What does he say? He said, Dad. He says, no. He says, we were actually playing who can hold their breath the shortest. Some people you just can't beat. That's Paul. Not because he's changing the rules. Rome said, we'll lock you up. Paul said, okay, I'll preach to the guards. Well, you won't have any outside influence. Paul said, perfect. Now others will. Well, how about this, Paul? We'll just kill you. Paul said, oh, that's the best part. Now I get to be with Jesus, my Savior. What do you do with a guy like that? There is no losing scenario. And listen, this isn't Paul being some eternal optimist. This isn't the power of positive thinking. Paul hadn't lost touch with reality. Paul wasn't ignoring his problems. The secret to Paul's joy is that you can't take away what he was living for. Because all of us are living for something. Maybe we'd never say it out loud. Maybe we don't even recognize, maybe we don't even realize consciously what it is. But there's something underneath our lives that says, as long as I have fill in the blank, I'll be okay. As long as I'm financially stable, I'm okay. As long as my health is good, I'm good. As long as my kids turn out okay, I'll be okay. As long as people like me, I'm fine. And none of those things are bad. The problem comes when a good thing becomes a thing that you have to have in order to be okay. Because the moment you build your life on something you lose, listen, you give that thing power over you to control you. If you live for the approval of others, then every criticism that comes your way will crush you. If you live for money, every unexpected bill will become a crisis. If you live for comfort, every inconvenience feels unbearable. If you live for, listen, anything in this life, eventually, you name it, it's going to be taken from you. It's not going to last. You say, what do we do? Paul says, listen, I've found something that even death can't take from me. And in fact, he says, death, it brings me closer to what I'm living for. This is what he says in verse 22. Look at verse 22. He said, if I'm going to live, if I'm to go on living in the body, well, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, and notice this, he says, what shall I choose? He says, I don't know. What's he talking about? He's talking about living or dying. Like, is that how we'd be in prison? We're facing death. He's like, man, this is a hard choice. I don't know. He says, I'm torn between the two. Pros and cons, right? Pros and cons. He said, on one hand, he said, I desire to depart and be with Christ. He says, which is better by far. I said, oh yeah. I guess we should talk about this side. You almost hear the sigh here. It's like, but it's necessary. Got a job to do. It's necessary for you he's like, you guys are inconveniencing me. I want to be with Jesus. Isn't this crazy? But it's necessary for you, he says, for the church, the Philippians, that I remain in the body, that I stay alive. Convinced of this, he says, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. Paul says, if I had a choice, I'd rather go and be with Jesus. But he also knows that if God leaves him there, what does he say? He says, there's fruitful labor for me here. There's work. There's work. There's spiritual work for me to do. He says it's more necessary for you. Everybody say, for you. For you. Why was Paul living? He's saying selfishly going to heaven would be amazing. He says, but until Jesus calls me home, he says, I'm going to do everything I can to bring as many people as I can with me. I think so often we get this backwards. Here's how we think. We think one day I'll be with God in heaven, and so it's probably going to be really boring, right? One day I'll be there, and so it's just going to be a bunch of harps and clouds and holy stuff. So right now, while I'm on earth, I got to get all the fun stuff in. Isn't this how we think? We think for me to live is pleasure, is fun, and to die is loss, is the end of fun. And then for some Christians, we can almost swing too far the opposite direction. You say, I don't think that way. Well, for some Christians, we think, man, this world is terrible. Man, there's nothing for me here. Everything fun, it's probably sinful anyways. Man, I'm just trying to survive until Jesus takes me home. For some Christians, for you, it's almost to live is misery and to die is gain. But notice Paul doesn't say either one of those. He says to live is Christ and to die is gain. Listen, Paul wasn't enduring today, waiting for something better tomorrow. And he wasn't clinging to today because he was afraid of tomorrow. No matter what happened to Paul, he couldn't lose. Why? Look what he was living for. For you. Because you can't lose if you're not living for what you can lose. Finally, you say, Pastor Matt, how can I be okay when life is not okay? And finally, number 3 is this. Don't let opposition intimidate your obedience. Look at verse 27. Paul says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, he says, I will know that you stand firm. Everybody say, stand firm. In one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. And catch this, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. Look what he says. He says, this is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved. And that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to what? Suffer for him. Since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had. and now hear that I still have. What's going on here? Notice Paul turns the attention away here from himself and back to them. He says, okay, he says, you know what's happening to me. Now let's talk about you. Because the Philippians, they were facing opposition of their own. And Paul's concern isn't that they somehow figure out how to avoid it. His concern is that they don't let fear keep them from faithfulness. Look again at verse 27. Look at that phrase. He said, whatever happens, he says, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. I love these first two words, whatever happens. In other words, as we've been saying this whole time, you don't control what happens to you. You can't control what happens around you, but you do decide how faithfully you follow Jesus right in the middle of it. Jesus tells us himself that if you follow him, to expect persecution. Paul here, just simply, he didn't even tell us that. He just assumes that that's the case. Verse 28, he says, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. He's like, there's gonna be people who oppose you. Why? Because the gospel that saves us puts us at odds with the world around us. And here's what he's saying. He's saying that opposition doesn't mean that we're on the wrong path. And that's important for us to hear because our natural instinct is to interpret resistance as a reason to retreat. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. Maybe I shouldn't take a stand. Maybe I should just go along. Maybe obedience isn't worth the cost. And here's what Paul says. He says, don't be intimidated. And then he tells us how that's possible. He says, stand firm. Stand firm. Verse 27. Notice the words here. In one spirit, striving, what's the next word? Together. And notice again, as one for the faith of the gospel. Notice how many times Paul emphasizes unity, togetherness. Paul doesn't tell them, hey, just toughen up and be brave. He tells them the only way you can stay tough is by standing together. Because it's a lot easier to stand your ground when you're not standing alone. For all you football fans out there, think of an offensive line. Those of you who don't know football, these are the 5 enormous guys whose job is to basically to keep the other enormous guys from getting to the guy with the football. Now imagine for a second you're standing on an NFL offensive line. You look across the line of scrimmage and standing 6 inches from your nose are 4 300-pound grizzly bears wearing helmets. And in about 2 seconds, somebody's going to snap that football, and their entire goal is to physically relocate your body against your will to get to the quarterback. I don't know about you, but I'm going to stick to pickleball. I'm going to tell the quarterback, I'm going to look back at him and be like, listen, man, you're on your own. But somehow these guys don't run away. They plant their feet, they hold the line. You say, how do they do it? Here's the key. They're not standing there. alone. There's a whole line of guys shoulder to shoulder with them. And if that offensive line is going to hold, they got to move together. They know their assignments. They protect the gaps. They hold their formation. And that's the picture Paul is giving us right here. Stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. He says opposition's coming. He doesn't pretend it's not. He says you're about to get hit like a truck. And when following Jesus gets costly, he says, we lock arms and say, we're not moving. And when Paul says we do this, he says, what happens? He says, this is a sign to them. It's a sign that they'll be destroyed. In other words, the way we hold the line together becomes a witness to the very people trying to break through it. Our world sees a group of people who should be terrified, but we're together. We should be turning on each other. Instead, we're standing there with arms linked together. He's saying if we truly live this way, our world will ask, what do they have that makes Jesus worth all of that? Because notice, Paul never promises that if they stand together, the opposition will go away. In fact, he almost says the exact opposite. He says, for it has been granted to you. Notice this word. This gets crazy. Notice this word. Did you guys see this? For it has been granted to you. What does that word mean? It has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, like God gives us the faith to believe, but also to what? To suffer. It's a strange verse. Notice Paul says suffering for Jesus has been granted to us as if it's a privilege. He's not saying suffering itself is good. And notice he's not only saying that it's a powerful witness when we suffer for Jesus. He's already said that. Here's what he's saying. Don't miss this. He's also saying this, that there's a deep kind of joy found in suffering for him. Hear me clearly. This doesn't mean we should seek suffering. It's not what he's saying. He's saying when opposition comes, because it will come. Listen to what Hebrews says in Hebrews 12 verse 2 about Jesus. Listen. It says for the joy that lay before him, Jesus endured the cross. Think about those two words together, joy and cross. The greatest act of suffering in history was an act motivated by joy. Why? Because Jesus knew what his suffering was accomplishing. He was giving himself away in love to save us. And I think that's something so often we miss. Some of the deepest joy, hear me, if you don't catch anything else this morning, hear this. Some of the deepest joy you will ever experience is found not in living for yourself, but in sacrificially giving yourself away for someone else. That's the life Jesus lived. And now Paul says this, you've been given the privilege of following in his footsteps. Somehow on the other side of that sacrifice, he says, you'll discover this, that this isn't less life. This is life to the fullest. A joy that can never be taken. And remember, Paul isn't sitting somewhere in a comfortable seat telling us this. Remember, Paul is sitting in prison. He says, since you're going through the same struggle I had, and now that I still have, Paul says, I get it. He says, I'm in it. The struggle is real. But Paul doesn't talk about this like it's some miserable version of life. He says, what a privilege it is to suffer as he suffered, to stand as he stood, and to know that when we do, we're not doing it alone. Church, that's not a wasted life. It's a life that looks like Jesus. Can I ask you, if life stopped being okay tomorrow, would you still be okay? If not, what are you building your life on that Jesus is asking you to let go of? What comfort, what approval, what control, what security are you afraid to surrender because you think following Jesus might just cost too much? Is your confidence, listen, is your confidence truly in Jesus? Or is your confidence actually in Jesus just keeping your life the way you want it? Jesus said it this way. He said, whoever wants to save their life, what do? He said, you want to save your life? You want everything to be like it is? You're going to try to make, he says, you're going to save your life? He says, you're going to lose it. And then he says, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. The question isn't, what will following Jesus cost me? My friends, the question is, what will it cost me if I don't? Will you trust Jesus? Will you give him your whole life today? We have a connection card in the pew in front of you. If you have questions about anything we talked about today, fill one of those out. You could check that box next to salvation if you want to talk about your eternal security. If you don't know if you're going to heaven when you die, or I just welcome you to come find me after the service. I'd love to talk to you about that. You could fill out that card to set up a time to talk to me or one of our pastors later. Maybe you're ready. Maybe you say, I'm ready to trust Jesus, and now I'm ready to proclaim my faith through baptism. You could check that box on the card, put it in the offering box on one of the back walls, or you come find me after the service. Look, we want to help you however we can. We want to be able to pray with you. Let's go to the Lord in prayer right now. God, we need you, Father. And we thank you. I pray that you'd help us to trust you deeply. I'm so thankful for these truths this morning. Help us to just be stable in you. God, I pray that you would challenge our hearts. to live for more than ourselves. Would you surrender every heart in this room to you and help us to see that it's so much better, that you are good. I pray this in your name of Jesus. Amen.